The lantern flame dips low, throwing long shadows across the pump house floor. It's 3 hours past midnight in November 1887, and the stone walls exhale cold moisture into the darkness. Water drips somewhere in the shaft below, a steady metronome that's been counting seconds since the day shift departed. The massive iron pump stands in the center of the room, its piston rod extending upward through leather collars, still damp from afternoon use. The brass fittings gleam dully. Everything is silent except for that dripping, except for the occasional creak of cooling metal, except for a faint draft that moves through the space like breath. And then, barely perceptible at first, the piston begins to rise. Not with the violent thrust of steam pressure, not with the rhythmic cadence of a working engine, but slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if the machine itself had awakened in the darkness and decided to stretch. The iron rod slides upward through its guides with a whisper of oil and steel. The leather packing groans softly, 6 inches, 8 inches, a foot. The motion stops. The pump house returns to its dripping silence. The lantern flame steadies. Outside, frost settles on the roof timbers, and the November wind carries the scent of coal smoke from distant furnaces. Below, in the Lauhersaxelli, the vertical shaft that plunges 380 feet into the earth, something shifts in the darkness. A pressure pulse, a movement of air. The deep water column adjusts itself with a sound like distant thunder heard through stone. The piston waits at its new height, suspended, as if listening. First light comes grey through the pump house windows, revealing what the night concealed. Juhani Mekinen, the morning foreman, stops in the doorway with his hand still on the latch. His breath fogs in the November cold. The pump has risen. He crosses to the machinery, boots loud on the wet stone floor. The piston rod extends higher than it should, nearly 18 inches above its resting position from yesterday evening. The leather collars show fresh compression marks. The guide rails bear faint scratches of recent movement. "Viljo," he calls toward the door. "Come look at this." Viljo Heikkinen, younger, still stamping frost from his boots, joins him at the pump frame. Together they examine the mechanism in the strengthening daylight. The iron is cold to the touch, slick with condensation. The stuffing box packing is damp but intact. The valve stems show no signs of tampering. "Did someone run the pump last night?" Viljo asks, though both men know the answer. The boiler is stone cold, no coal in the firebox. The steam pressure gauge reads 0, its needle resting against the pin with absolute finality. Mekinen runs his hand along the piston rod, feeling for heat, for any residual warmth that might suggest recent operation. Nothing. The metal temperature matches the ambient air, perhaps 4 degrees Celsius, no more. He kneels to inspect the base where the rod disappears into the pump cylinder. Water has pooled here, seeping up from below. Fresh water, clear and cold. "Check the shaft," he says quietly. They move to the opening where the main pipe descends into darkness, the Lauhersaxelli, lined with granite blocks that glisten with perpetual moisture. A draught rises from below, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth and standing water. Viljo lowers a lantern on its chain, watching the light recede into the shaft. At 380 feet, it becomes a pinpoint, dancing slightly. "Water level looks normal," Viljo reports, his voice echoing strangely in the vertical chamber. Mekinen says nothing. He's watching the pump piston, which hasn't moved since they arrived. Solid, motionless, waiting for steam pressure that won't come for another hour when the fireman arrives to kindle the morning fire. But something moved it during the night. The dripping continues its steady count. By the 3rd week of November, the nocturnal movements have become routine enough to log. The day shift supervisor, Alexei Vertnin, maintains a notebook with precise measurements. Each morning, piston height, water temperature in the shaft, barometric pressure, outside air temperature. The numbers accumulate but reveal no obvious pattern. What becomes clear is the irregularity. Some nights the pump rises 20 inches, other nights only 6. Occasionally it doesn't move at all, though these still nights are becoming less frequent. The movement always occurs between midnight and dawn, always when the pump house is empty and the boiler cold. The machinery never descends, only rises, as if drawing water upward through pure intention. On the 24th of November, Vertinen stays late, sitting in the corner with a thick wool coat and a flask of coffee. The lantern burns beside him. He watches the pump from 8 in the evening until well past midnight, noting every sound, every shift in the draft patterns, every change in the acoustic quality of the dripping water below. At 2:47 a.m., the pump begins to move. It starts with a sound he almost misses, a deep resonance from the Lauhausaxelli felt more than heard, a pressure pulse that makes the stones hum. The draft from the shaft changes direction momentarily, exhaling instead of inhaling. Then the piston rod trembles, settles, and begins its slow ascent. Vertinen rises from his chair, notebook forgotten. He crosses to the pump, one hand extended toward the moving iron. The motion is steady, inexorable, silent, except for the whisper of metal through packing. He can see no force acting on the rod, no pressure differential in the visible piping, no steam, no hydraulic surge, no pneumatic drive. Just movement. The rod rises 14 inches over the course of 12 minutes, then stops with a finality that seems almost conscious. The deep pulse from below repeats once, a subsonic throb that Vertinen feels in his chest, and then silence returns. He stands in the cold pump house until dawn, but the machinery doesn't move again. In his report, he writes, "The pump operates on principles not included in its design specifications." The testing begins systematically. Vertinen brings in Oskar Lundqvist, the mine's chief mechanic, a man who has serviced every pump and valve in the facility for 32 years. Together, they disassemble the upper assembly, examining each component for defects that might explain autonomous motion. The piston rings, intact, properly tensioned, showing normal wear patterns. The stuffing box packing, replaced only 6 weeks prior, still flexible and well-oiled. The check valves in the cylinder base, operating correctly, sealing completely when pressure is applied in reverse. They test the valve stems with careful attention, pressing each one closed by hand, feeling for any give in the springs, any hesitation in the return. The inlet valve shows slight wear on the seat, nothing unusual for a pump in continuous service. The outlet valve clicks shut with reassuring firmness. "There's nothing wrong with this pump," Lundqvist says, wiping oil from his hands. "It shouldn't move without steam pressure, and it certainly shouldn't move upward against the weight of the rod assembly." They descend to the shaft opening and lower a weighted line to measure the water column. The plumb bob takes nearly 40 seconds to reach water, confirming the 380-foot depth recorded during the shaft's initial survey. The water level reads consistent with recent measurements, approximately 12 feet below the pump intake. Vertinen leans over the opening, feeling the draft. Today it rises steadily, cool but not cold, carrying that perpetual mineral scent. He notices something he missed before. The draft isn't constant. It pulses faintly, as if the shaft itself is breathing. The interval is irregular, sometimes 15 seconds between pulses, sometimes 40. "Do you feel that?" he asks Lundqvist. The older man joins him at the shaft opening, one hand on the granite rim. They wait in silence. The pulse comes again, a subtle increase in air pressure from below, barely enough to move the lantern flame hanging nearby. "Pressure equalization," Lundqvist suggests. "Temperature differential between surface and depth, normal in a shaft this deep." But his voice lacks certainty. They close the pump house at dusk, after reassembling everything to original specifications. Vertinen leaves a pencil balanced on the piston rod collar, a simple indicator that will fall if the machinery moves even slightly. In the morning, the pencil lies on the floor 6 feet away. The piston has risen 19 inches. By mid-December, word has reached the mining company's headquarters in Helsinki. They send 2 engineers, Henrik Niemanen, a specialist in hydraulic systems, and Carl Johan Ström, who has designed pumping stations across Scandinavia. They arrive with surveying equipment, pressure gauges, and detailed schematics of the installation. Niemanen establishes a baseline of measurements. He places pressure sensors at the shaft opening, halfway down, and just above the water surface. He measures air temperature at 10-foot intervals throughout the entire descent. He records barometric pressure every 6 hours. The data begins to accumulate in neat columns in his field notebook. Sturm focuses on the pump mechanism itself, taking it apart again, this time documenting every clearance, every tolerance, every potential leak path. He fabricates a glass inspection window for the cylinder base, allowing observation of the check valves during operation. He installs a mechanical indicator that will record any rod movement with precision down to 1 millimeter. The nocturnal movements continue. On December 18th, the pump rises 23 inches, the largest displacement yet recorded. On the 19th, only 4 inches. On the 20th, nothing. On the 21st, 17 inches. Niemanen notices something in his pressure data. The movements correlate, not perfectly, but significantly, with temperature changes in the shaft. Specifically, with the differential between the surface air temperature and the deep water temperature. On nights when the outside air drops below -10 Celsius, the pump rises more dramatically. On warmer nights, the movement is subdued. It's thermal, he tells Sturm, but I can't explain the mechanism. Sturm has his own observation. The check valves, when observed through the glass window during a nocturnal movement, don't behave normally. The inlet valve trembles, not opening fully, but hovering in a state between open and closed. Hysteresis, he calls it. The valve can't decide which state it should occupy. Pressure oscillation, Sturm suggests. Something is creating alternating positive and negative pressure in the water column. The valve responds but can't stabilize. They attempt to measure this oscillation directly, lowering a pressure gauge into the shaft on a cable. The gauge shows variations, subtle but definite. The water column experiences periodic pressure increases of approximately 0.3 bar, followed by decreases of similar magnitude. The interval matches the pulse they've all felt and heard. But what creates this oscillation? On December 27th, during a particularly cold night with clear skies and temperatures dropping to -15 Celsius, Niemanen remains in the pump house with complete instrumentation. He records everything: air pressure, air temperature, shaft draft direction and velocity, water temperature, and pump rod position. At 2:23 a.m., the sequence begins. First, the surface air temperature drops sharply, -2 degrees in 10 minutes as radiation cooling accelerates under the clear sky. Second, the draft in the shaft reverses, beginning to blow downward. Third, the pressure gauge at the shaft bottom shows a sudden decrease, -0.4 bar. Fourth, the water column begins to pulse. Fifth, the pump rod trembles, settles, and begins to rise. Niemanen watches it happen in real time, instruments confirming what his senses tell him. The cold night air, denser and heavier than the warm air below, plunges down the shaft like water down a drain. This creates suction in the water column. The suction pulls upward on the pump piston. The check valves, caught in their state of hysteresis, allow partial backflow. The water column oscillates between tension and compression. The pump rises. But this explanation is incomplete. Why does the motion persist for 12 minutes? Why does it stop so abruptly? What role does the condensation play? The answer will take 30 more years to fully articulate. The final explanation arrives not in 1887, but in 1919, published in an obscure engineering journal by a researcher named Toivo Järvinen, who studied the historical records and conducted modern thermodynamic analysis. The pump filled itself through a cascade of coupled phenomena, no single effect sufficient, but their combination creating sustained, autonomous motion. First, condensation-induced vacuum. The iron pipe, exposed to -15-degree air at the surface and 4-degree water at 380 feet depth, became an enormous condensing chamber. Water vapor in the air column condensed on the cold metal, creating a partial vacuum. This vacuum pulled upward on the water column, creating tension that transmitted to the pump piston. Second, siphon potential in the vertical geometry. The 380-foot water column, when placed under tension by the vacuum above, began to act like a siphon attempting to establish flow. Though no actual siphon formed, the geometry prevented it. The tendency towards siphon flow created periodic surges as the water column tried and failed to equalize pressure. Third, thermal contraction of the air column. As the night air cooled and plunged down the shaft, it compressed the air trapped between the descending cold front and the water surface. This compression increased pressure momentarily, then released as the cold air reached the water and equalized. The cycle repeated irregularly, driven by surface temperature fluctuations and draft turbulence. Fourth, check valve hysteresis. The valves, designed to open at specific pressure differentials, found themselves operating in a regime where pressure oscillated around their trigger point. They vibrated between states, partially open, partially closed, allowing water to flow backward through the pump in small increments. Fifth, column weight modulation. Each backward flow through the pump reduced the effective weight of water in the column, which reduced the downward force on the piston, which allowed the vacuum and siphon effects to dominate, which pulled the rod upward. The motion was self-reinforcing until thermal equilibrium returned at dawn. Sixth, the pulse. The pressure oscillations created by thermal cycling in the shaft generated a rhythmic surge, not regular enough to be harmonic, but persistent enough to create the subsonic pulse that workers felt and heard. This pulse synchronized with the valve hysteresis, creating a ratcheting effect that prevented the piston from falling back to its resting position. Järvinen's paper included detailed calculations showing that these effects, combined on a particularly cold, clear night with proper initial conditions, could generate upward force on the piston of approximately 1,200 newtons, more than sufficient to overcome friction and lift the rod assembly. The pump filled itself because physics demanded it. The machinery became an instrument playing a song written by thermodynamics, pressure differentials, and the long vertical geometry of the shaft. No supernatural forces, no unexplained phenomena, just the patient, inevitable operation of natural law in a system complex enough to surprise its designers. The pump house in question continued operation until 1934, when electric pumps replaced the old steam machinery. The Lauhausaxelli was sealed and forgotten. But on cold November nights, maintenance workers in adjacent buildings reported feeling a subsonic pulse through the foundation stones, a rhythm that matched the breathing of deep earth and cold iron. There's a particular quality to industrial machinery that reveals itself only in stillness. In operation, a pump is noise and purpose, steam pressure driving pistons, valves opening and closing with mechanical precision, water flowing upward against gravity because human engineering commands it. The machine serves. It obeys. It has no life of its own. But in the cold hours after midnight, when the boiler fire has died and the day shift sleeps in distant homes, the machinery returns to a more fundamental state. It becomes again what it always was, an assembly of matter subject to the same physical laws that govern falling water, rising heat, and the slow, patient movement of air seeking equilibrium. The pump that filled itself at night wasn't haunted. It was simply embedded in a system, shaft, water column, atmosphere, stone, large enough and complex enough that its behavior transcended simple mechanical prediction. The engineers who designed it understood pistons and valves and steam pressure. They couldn't foresee how 380 feet of vertical geometry would couple with November cold and condensation cycles to create autonomous motion. This is the humbling lesson of industrial systems. We build them with precision and control them with confidence, but they exist in a world governed by thermodynamics and fluid dynamics and 1,000 subtle gradients we cannot fully predict. Sometimes, on cold, clear nights when conditions align, the machinery remembers this. It responds not to human command, but to ancient imperatives. Pressure seeking balance, heat flowing toward cold, matter arranging itself according to laws that existed before engineers and will persist after them. The workers who witnessed the nocturnal movements never quite lost their unease, even after the explanation arrived. Because the explanation, while complete, doesn't erase the experience of watching a massive iron pump rise in darkness without human agency. It doesn't silence the memory of that deep pulse from the Lauhersaxelli, felt through stone and boot, leather and bone. Knowledge explains. It doesn't always comfort. By the 1930s, electric pumps had replaced steam machinery throughout the facility. The old pump house became a storage shed, then an office, then was torn down entirely. The Lauhersaxelli was capped with a concrete seal and buried under gravel and eventual pavement. The shaft still exists, far below the modern surface. 380 feet of granite-lined vertical space, filled now with still water and darkness and pressure that slowly equalizes across the seasons. On November nights, when the temperature drops below -10 and the sky clears to reveal stars sharp as iron, frost forms on the pavement above the forgotten shaft. Occasionally, late workers crossing the lot report feeling something through their feet, a tremor, a pulse, nothing they can quite articulate. The sensation lasts only a moment. The physics is patient. The stone remembers. And somewhere in the cold vertical darkness, water still seeks its level, air still contracts and expands, and the ancient machinery of pressure and vacuum continues its silent operation. The pump filled itself at night, because the night, in those hours between midnight and dawn, was exactly the right instrument to play it.